Good morning. Welcome to committee members and the public to the 8th meeting in 2013 of the Health and Sport Committee. And as usual at this point, can I remind you to switch off mobile phones, Blackberries, other wireless devices, as they can often interfere with the sound system. Our first item on the agenda today is a decision on whether to take item 4 in private. Item 4 is a decision on a proposal future external meeting. Can I have the committee's agreement that we take that item in private? Thank you. Our second item on the agenda today is to consider 2 negative Scottish statutory instruments. And the first is SSI 2013-52, National Health Service Scotland Inquiry Benefits Amendment Regulations 2013. There have been no motions to annul. The Subordinate Legislation Committee has drawn the instrument to the Parliament's attention. Details are contained, as you would have seen in your papers. If there are no comments from members, I will put the question, which is on the motion before you on SSI 2013-52. Is that agreed? Okay. The second SSI for the committee's consideration today is SSI 2013-53, Personal Injuries NHS Charges Amounts Scotland Amendment Regulations 2013. Again, there has been no motion to annul. The Subordinate Legislation Committee has not drawn the instrument to the Parliament's attention. Is there any comments from members on this? No. On that basis, then, can I put before you on SSI 2013-53, as already outlined? Are we all agreed? Thank you, that is agreed. Agenda item number 3, which is a one-off evidence session on post-traumatic stress. As this is a roundtable event, we will carry out a normal sort of procedure. We'll introduce ourselves. My name is Duncan McNeill. I'm the MSP for Greenock and Inverclyde, and I'm the convener of the committee.
Thank you, Convener. I'm Aileen MacLeod. I'm one of the List MSPs for the South of Scotland.
Nanette Milne, I'm List MSP for North East Scotland.
David Torrance, MSP for Cardiff constituency.
I'm Claire Fivey, Head of Service at the River Centre for Traumatic Stress in Edinburgh.
Mark MacDonald, List MSP for North East Scotland.
Gil Patterson, MSP for Clydebank Mulgai.
Kate Higgins from Children First.
Paul McLaughlin, Co-Project Manager of the Miscarriages of Justice Organisation.
Richard Simpson, Regional Member for Mid-Scotland and Fife.
I'm Elaine McBride from the Meadows Child and Adolescent Sexual Trauma Service, part of the NHS CAM service.
Bob Doris, MSP for Glasgow and Vice Convener of the Health and Sport Committee.
I'm Anne Douglas. I'm Head of the Trauma Service for NHS Greater Glasgow and Clyde.
Thank you for that. Can we go to our first question, which will be led by Bob Doris?
Thank you very much, Convener, and I'm delighted we're having this round table here this morning. Just put on my record our thanks to Miscarriage of Justice Organisation, who also did an informal session with part of the committee before this, and I know there was other informal sessions before the start of this meeting. We found it very, very helpful. Now, in terms of miscarriage of justice, it's been put to me, and I know from my own constituency caseload working with individuals, that those who commit a crime and are found guilty and do their sentence sometimes have more support than those who don't commit a crime, do a sentence and are found to be victims of a miscarriage of justice. And there's a definite service gap there in terms of the support that's available for those victims of a miscarriage of justice. Now, I want to widen it out. Clearly, I want to hear on the record what Mojo believe that service gap is. So I would appreciate information on that, but not just victims of miscarriage of justice, but others who have had trauma in their life. So whether it's child sexual trauma in terms of the services that are there for that, and in terms of how we deal with our military veterans as well. So 3 very distinct areas, of course, but I'm keen to hear, as an MSP, how the various groups feel, what services are there and where the inadequacies are.
I'll start on that if
Yes,
you don't mind.
please.
I mean, from your point of view as an organisation, there is no uniformed response to, certainly for a medical side of things, how a person who suffers a miscarriage of justice is treated when they're released from prison. What you may see in the public arena very often is we talk about this, the champagne cork moment on the appeal court steps, and everybody thinks that's the end of the story, and there you go, pat in the back, you've been given your freedom, and now you can go and live your life. Well, that's not what happens. What happens is that people may have a small period of euphoria after they've been released, but that is quickly followed by severe health problems. We are currently dealing with 35 individuals in Scotland who are miscarriage of justice victims, who are all diagnosed with post-traumatic stress disorder to varying degrees. The support that they get came through our organisation. There is no response within the judicial system initially on their release to explain to them that they may be a victim of a miscarriage of justice, that they may then have certain things that will happen to them in terms of their health. There's no recognition of that whatsoever. They're put out an appeal court door and sent home, and that is completely inadequate. That is not how people should be being treated in our society. We appreciate that the Scottish Government supports our organisation to do the work it does, but it's a sticking plaster on a huge problem. We spoke earlier with the MSPs saying that the government does fund the work we do, but it only covers maybe 25% of the work that we're expected to do. And that's dealing with the client group that we have, but also what is missed as well is that the effect that a miscarriage of justice to a family and a community, the effects that has on not just the person themselves, but widening out in circles to their family. There's no recognition. It's hard enough to get support for the miscarriage of justice person who needs medical support. There's no support for their families whatsoever, and no recognition that there's a need for support. So I'd start from that point of view.
Anyone else wish to respond to Bob's initial opening? Yes.
Children First provides abuse and trauma recovery support to children who have experienced trauma for a number of reasons, but mainly child sexual abuse, but also physical neglect and emotional abuse, particularly through the impact of living with violence in the home, domestic abuse. And we do that in 10 local authority areas. We also provide support in 4 additional areas for families where their children are affected by parental substance misuse, and quite a lot of that is actually kind of trauma work from abuse and neglect in children's earliest years. And also in 2 areas now, we also work directly with women who've been affected by domestic abuse to help them recover from that trauma, and adult survivors of childhood sexual abuse. In terms of our core abuse and trauma services across Scotland, we fund most of those services ourselves through fundraised income, because it's very difficult to source funding, either statutory funding or trust funding, other than for kind of small projects or pilots or kind of added value, if you like, into what we do. So we are paying for some of the most vulnerable children and young people in Scotland to receive services which are almost vital in terms of enabling them to recover and to go on and have normal, healthy lives. The other thing to say as well is that when we looked at all our services as part of our annual kind of outcomes work that we do, we were surprised to see that the waiting lists for these services are amongst the highest, in that there are more children requiring a service from us or being referred to us through a variety of agencies or coming to us directly from their families themselves, and we haven't got enough workers or enough capacity to meet demand. So just in terms of service gaps, we know as well that we sit within a kind of continuum and a broader array of abuse services that are provided through health service and also social work. But we know that there is a big service gap in terms of an unidentified, an unmet need for children and young people, particularly those who have experienced sexual abuse in their childhood. And I suppose the work of our survivors group came out of working with families because families have been referred into us because the children were at risk of moving into care, and there was quite often substance abuse, misuse happening. There's parents' violent relationships amongst the adults, and that was all impacting the children and young people. And what we discovered in working working directly with the parents in those situations was in every single case referred into as there had been unsupported childhood sexual abuse. And so I think the Scottish Government has done well in identifying the needs of adult survivors and having set up a fund, but it's small b, and there's not enough happening when children and young people are abused to support them to recover early, getting the right support in at the right time, both with them and their families. And actually, we're now actually having to put in place services to try and address those problems as they manifest in other social problems later on in life.
Anyone else?
Perhaps I could say something about the NHS response to PTSD. Trauma was identified as a priority in the recent mental health strategy, which came out just at the end of the year there. And I think the aspiration there is that all services should be trauma-informed, but there should also be some trauma-specific services, and therefore that people such as you described should have the opportunity to be referred for PTSD, and that needs to be recognised. So just to say something about the way services are organised in Glasgow, there's a distinction between what we call type 1 and type 2 trauma. Type 1 trauma is the car crash or the bang on the head, and type 2 trauma is, as you described, childhood sexual abuse, domestic violence, victims of trafficking, torture, which is lengthy, cumulative abuse, and the kind of mental health consequences of these conditions, of these traumas, are different. In Glasgow, we have specific services for asylum seekers and refugees. We have specific service at the moment, which is funded by the Scottish Government for survivors of trafficking. And we also have services for the homeless people with histories of complex trauma, and some specialist sexual abuse services. But in addition to that, it should be possible for anyone to be referred by their GP to a primary care mental health team or a community mental health team and receive treatment for PTSD. So,
some examples of how that works then. We've got one guy sitting here, Billy Mills is sitting across there. He's a victim of a miscarriage of justice. He actually spent longer waiting in treatment than he spent in prison, to be honest. So the service that's being offered, initially what we do is if somebody comes to us as a client, we take them to their GP. We have to explain to the GP what's actually entailed in being a miscarriage of justice, what that means. There's one study that's available, and it's by Adrian Grounds, and it's a study into wrongful imprisonment and its effects. We ask the GP to read that, and we then ask the GP, on the basis of what they've read, to try and get adequate services put in place for their patient. To be quite honest, it's a scattergun effect. You may get a psychologist that understands and is willing to understand, or you may get somebody who, like say we've had clients who once it's been explained to the mental health team what's entailed in their case, they may sit down with a psychologist whose initial question is, would you like to discuss your offence? Would you like to discuss how your victim felt? Now, obviously, as soon as you start from that point of view, our clients can then work with that person, and that is a common experience. Our clients' common experience is that they may take a number of years before they ever find anybody with any clear understanding of what they're talking about, before they can begin to get treated. The problem with that is that because of the nature of the post-traumatic stress disorder they're suffering, that that stress and that condition is compounded when it's left untreated. It so happens today is the 22nd anniversary of the release of the Birmingham Six. We were set up by a member of the Birmingham Six, Paddy Hill. Paddy Hill has been through a number of situations throughout the years where he's went to various services. He's been told by some of the top clinicians in the UK that he is one of the most traumatised persons that they've ever met. But he still remains untreated. He still remains in a situation whereby his post-traumatic stress disorder has never been tackled properly. He's never been given an area or a place he can go to that allows what's happened to him to be properly examined. What happens is that Paddy and our clients are fitted in. It's like square pegs and round holes, and that's what happens to our clients. Because there is no recognition of the condition that they are, or the circumstances of the condition that their post-traumatic stress comes from, it then makes it difficult to even take the first step to treatment.
Is this to get you know onto it, because is this a situation that's exceptional to your group, or is it exceptional to those who have suffered sexual abuse, or those who I spoke to this morning, the mother of a murder victim, or that police officer that was investigating over a long period of time sexual crimes that became a victim herself to the knowledge she was dealing to? It came to me this morning, I throw this out, that what we're dealing here is a level of mental health problems that we're unable. They are all suffering the same or similar anguish, loneliness, mental health problems, displayed as physical problems, and they explain a situation where it's long waiting lists, it's a situation where they find it very hard to get their problems diagnosed, accepted, and then when they do, they wait a long time for an assessment, and then after the assessment, for some people, according to what we heard in the private session, it can get worse because they're waiting a long time in that assessment. And then when they wait in the assessment, they're sent to group work, which might not be appropriate for them. And it's one-to-one they need. And all of that can take a very long time indeed. Is there capacity in the system to... Should we be describing it as post-traumatic stress? Because people are saying to me this morning, that sounds as if I was in a war zone. I was in a personal war zone, but I was never in a war zone. This is happening here, you know, not somewhere far away. Anyway, I've prompted some others to come in. Yes, please.
Yes, can I comment on that? I think you're absolutely right. I think miscarriages of justice need to be put in the context of trauma much more generally. And trauma can be simple, complex, acute, chronic. There's a huge, huge range of trauma reactions. We've seen a number of cases of people who have suffered from miscarriages of justice over the years. And you're absolutely right that the manifestations of trauma in these cases are very, very far-reaching, very severe consequences of that type of trauma. But I think you put your finger on it when you said that the effects of trauma for your clients have not been recognised, and I think this is the case much more broadly than just for miscarriages of justice or even for victims of sexual abuse as children. We see the whole range at the River Centre. We see survivors of torture, we see veterans of the armed forces, we see people who've suffered from domestic violence, you name it. We see the whole range of human misery. And the problem, I would say, is not so much a gap in services. It's the level of awareness of trauma that exists. So the effects of trauma are not being picked up. And I think that goes for the effects of trauma in childhood as well as in adulthood. So people are not making that connection between a trauma that may occur, whether it's a one-off or a repeated, prolonged trauma. They're not making the connection between that and the physical or mental health problems that develop later on.
Can I just add a little sort of bit to that, which is this is the thing about a trauma-informed service, because if you ask a person in the street, why do people have mental health problems, they'll say because of what's happened to them. But often the mental health service says, what's wrong with you? So if you ask someone what's happened to you, they can tell you, and then that puts a different slant on your assessment of what's wrong. Mm-hmm. But if you start off from what's wrong, you might never get to what's happened.
Sorry, Richard. I think that's the main problem, that everybody expects that if you go and try to get treatment, that the person that you're dealing with should be an expert in what your problem is. We know fine well that that's not often the case, that many medical conditions remain a mystery, and it takes research to find out how to treat certain problems. That's the situation that we feel we're in, that because of the lack of understanding, because of the lack of research, because of the lack of education of clinicians and basically everybody else involved in the system, that we can't even break through the initial barrier to try and get that understanding that our clients need. And it takes so long to get the understanding, again, that it compounds the whole problem.
Yes, Elaine.
Speaking again from a child and adolescent point of view, because I'm with NHS Lothian in a specialist service that works with childhood sexual abuse, but also I work within the larger child and adolescent mental health service, so I see what's going on in the general mental health teams, and everything that isn't sexual abuse trauma would go into general mental health referral teams, of which my colleagues are, you know, extreme. Well, I mean, I know there'll be different kinds of experience, but a lot of experience. But there are huge treatment waiting lists. And one of my bugbears, I guess, is that some of these, I feel, get hidden because the targets to get people seen by a certain amount of time means that they're seen for an assessment, but they're still waiting on a separate list for treatment. And I just don't think that it should become the clinicians, I suppose, problem of get them seen, get them seen. It also means that the criteria for being referred in, the more that there's waiting lists, gets higher. So the tariff gets higher, and it gets very, very medical, I think, which actually gets a lot of people out of it. So we've ended up in our team who work in a very different way because it's sexual trauma. We end up sometimes taking on non-sexual single incident traumas because they're never going to get seen. Not because of a lack of willingness, but just a lack of people to see it.
Is that something that you've experienced that in other areas where the assessment process is more to do with managing the waiting list rather than that, you know, we see it's, you know, accusations have been made that the assessment process in social work care can be delayed and delayed and delayed because we're managing a budget or we're managing you know, the waiting list through because the demand's so great.
They can guarantee they'll be seen, clapped eyes on within the whatever the waiting list target is, or some won't make that at all, but by and large they'll be seen. But they'll either only be seen once, this is general mental health I'm talking about, not just trauma, might just be seen the once and not being seen to reach the tariff to be seen for more sessions. But if they are, there'll be, well, sir, I'm only speaking for NHS Lothian, there will be a separate waiting list.
Is that common? Is that how the waiting list?
It's not that unusual, but with the heat targets, it's going to change because it'll be waiting time to psychological treatment, and that will be kicking in December 2014. So that that kind of assessment waiting list, treatment waiting list, should be a thing of the past with the new heat target.
How will they do it?
I don't know how they'll do it with the current resources they have, because speaking from colleagues that are doing this day in, day out, I don't know how they could possibly see the number they're seeing if they were having to go on. I just fear that the tariff again will get higher and more medical. I think, you know, there's a willingness with trauma, for example. We're trying to expand into a full trauma team, but we can't get the resources to do it. So I think there's a lot of the type 1 kind of traumas that don't get a particularly good service, or they have to wait for a service. I mean, the service they'll get when they get it will be good, but they'll have to wait for it.
Any of the other panellists and witnesses before I bring Bob back in for his follow-up question? Kate?
You go, Claire.
I was just going to say, I think the difficulty you have is that the demand is always going to exceed the supply in this case. Trauma is a big catch-all term that takes in such a wide range of reactions, children, adolescents, adults, that you are never going to have specialist services who can meet that demand. And that's why there's been a big push to roll out training so that workers in the community, CPNs, community teams can have treatments, evidence-based treatments that they can offer to people in these situations. There's been a big training program aimed at training up people in the community to do this. So it is being addressed, but this is going to take time.
Okay. I'll take you back in. I mean, but
Sorry,
Kate's
sorry.
going to... yeah.
I was just going to comment on exactly that. You know, the demand is always going to be higher than, and services will struggle to keep up. But I think quite reassuringly, the figures last year from the NHS on the number of staff employed in CAMHS in child and adolescent mental health services showed an increase. And it would be interesting to track that to see what Claire's saying, that there's a big investment happening, and also the impact of the new mental health strategy, to see if that increase in numbers of staff continues. And while that's reassuring, what's worrying is when you actually look at it on a health board area, because some health boards have actually, you can see, have made active investment decisions to beef up their teams, and that basically contributes to the overall totals. And the other thing as well, when we looked at those figures, is that quite a lot of the staff are hospital-based in acute trust settings and not out in the community. So, you know, from our experience of how children who've experienced abuse and trauma in their lives come through, they don't tend to come through the medical route so much, they tend to come through social work. So if there's less staff based in the community settings, that's one of the reasons why perhaps they find it harder to access services. And I think it would just be useful for a committee to look at how resources are being deployed and how health boards are making decisions about how to deploy the resources and where. And within that, to look at the new Highland service in terms of them being the first to integrate health and social care. Because I think one of the things for children and young people, and we know this from working with kinship carers, there's a group of families who find it really hard to access therapeutic services and support for the trauma that their children have received, and even just support for themselves to be able to cope and to have the capacity to cope, to support their children themselves. But one of the issues that they have is because all of their interaction is with social work services, and yet what it is that they need to access is CAMHS, and they find that quite a difficult bridge to cross.
Lane, just before I go.
Well, just on that point, I would agree largely. I mean, a lot of our referrals come in from social work. I'm trying very much to work alongside social work, and particularly with children, with the child system, and the whole GERFIC kind of getting it right for every child. You know, way of working is a very time-consuming way of working. It's the only way to work with children and families, but I think it is incredibly time-consuming. I think the training you were talking about, I think there has been a lot of training being put forward. I've found that my colleagues in child and adolescent work have found it difficult to get places on those training things. It's quite adult, evidence-based training, which people say, well, that's not evidence-based for children, but there's a lot of things we use in trauma work with children that may not be evidence-based because there's just not been the research to do it, but we know it works. And I think, you know, we're not getting enough training on that. And the only other thing is, I think the looked after and accommodated population, I think, get a raw deal because they have that long-term, often neglect type of trauma that is hugely time-consuming to work with. You're working with a huge system of people around a child, and it's extremely complex trauma, and it takes a huge amount of time, and I don't think they get the service they require when they need it, which is when they're young, not when they're adults and gone off the rails completely. We have a service for the secondary traumatisation of parents, non-abusing parents, because actually the research we did showed that actually they were showing up as traumatised in their own rights if their child had been abused, you know, if they weren't implicated in it. And actually there's no point in plucking a child out and doing work with them and putting them back into that traumatised system. So there has to be an availability, and if you can get in early with the carers or parents, sometimes the child doesn't need to be seen. If you can actually help the parent become back in the driving seat. Otherwise, they can feel quite disempowered when everybody rushes in and does things for the child, but they're feeling they can't do it.
Could I say on that as well? I mean, I couldn't agree more. The failure is not to intervene early in our cases, and if that was available, early intervention and even an explanation to the person that may develop post-traumatic stress disorder, that they may begin to have problems, and explain what the problems may be, that they may be able to cope better. We spoke earlier and Billy made a good comment. Basically, Billy said that he was a victim of the state kidnapping. Now, and we've heard in the past hostages for Lebanon, when they were brought back to this country, they were instantly treated. They were taken to proper medical centres, given appropriate treatment there and then when they returned, and that was followed through in order to reacclimatise them back into their communities in our society. That's what our clients need. They need that early intervention to give them some hope and some ability of understanding what may happen to them, and put in strategies to allow them to try and cope with the situation by themselves. And hopefully, if you get in early, you're not going to need long-term treatment, intensive long-term treatment, and it's the failure to act early that's creating the situation that it's prolonging the need for treatment over time.
Bob?
Thanks. Lots of really interesting comments. Some of it I think is very, very helpful. In the case of what we heard in relation to Glasgow, I know because I took a direct interest in access to psychological services for children within Greater Glasgow and Clyde, and there has been a dramatic fall in the waiting time there. I have to say, from a shamefully high level of about a year and a half down to about 26 weeks or so. I'm happy to correct the record if I got that wrong, but I think it's roughly around that time. However, I'm keen to put additional pressure on services, convener, because we can have a discussion around those that are in the system already and how long it takes those to get appropriate services, but it's about need that's not currently been captured, and I think that's why I led on the miscarriage of justice situation. The positive aspect I got was that Greater Glasgow and Clyde seem to be developing a range of specialist trauma services, whether it's in relation to refugees and asylum seekers, whether it's in relation to sexual trauma. I'm just wondering whether consideration has been given, or it would be given in the future, to a specialist service in relation to victims of miscarriage of justice, and how that would be taken about. But of course, for that to happen, whether it's victims of miscarriage of justice or returning veterans or child sexual trauma, GPs, if they are the first point of referral, have to be suitably trained and know what the referral procedures are. So in terms of should there be a specialist service, in terms of how well informed and trained are GPs, and chance my arm with a third question there, convener, because I think it all ties together nicely, is with the best will in the world, specialists can design a bespoke service, but you really need to be listening to the victims of sexual abuse, the victims of a miscarriage of justice, and those that have suffered in war zones, to talk to them about what that service may look like to suit them. So in terms of where we are today as a committee, I would like the views obviously of perhaps Dr Douglas or Elaine McBride in terms of specialist services, including victims of miscarriage of justice, how we make sure GPs are suitably informed and trained, and how we also make sure people are prioritised through the system and are part of designing what that service should look like. So I know there's a lot in that, but it's not an uncomplicated issue. It has to be complex to get it right. So I'm keen to know people's views in relation to that.
Big question.
Yeah.
I think we're all involved in providing ongoing training for GPs in identifying trauma, and I know, Claire, at the Rivers, that you're going to be involved in training GPs in identifying trauma.
Yes,
Right?
yes. Yep. Do you want
to say something about that?
The Scottish Government's commissioned us at the Rivers Centre to carry out a project looking at the level of awareness of trauma among GPs in primary care throughout Lothian. And on the back of that, once we establish the level of awareness, to design an intervention aimed at raising that awareness. And we're in the process of doing that. It's a 3-year project that's been funded by the Scottish Government.
Is victims of miscarriage of justice within the scope of what you're looking at currently in relation to that project?
Yes, I mean, it's trauma in its widest sense, so it would come under that, yes.
Okay.
I think what I was trying to relay earlier, and waiting times and other things, was the conversation we had with 3 people who had been through this system, and waiting's a problem. It wasn't necessarily the GP. Sometimes it was the accidental engagement with a health visitor treating someone else. In other cases, it was a referral to a CPN that did it, and the GP. Another case, it was a GP from that woman's case right to the River Centre, which was, which again shows this patchy approach and this people battling through the system. Is there any? Yeah.
That's exactly the problem. If you talk to most of the patients we see at the River Centre, most will have taken quite a circuitous route to get to our service, and that will have taken a long time. So, apart from the wait that they have once they've been referred, there's also this wait to get to be referred, and that's about having the problem identified as being a trauma problem. And to me, that's where the nub of the problem is. The effects of trauma are not recognised. And that's where I think the main training needs to be going, in educating and raising awareness of trauma reactions, not just among GPs, but at accident and emergency departments, in the community, with mental health teams, with health visitors, with, right across the board, raising that awareness, putting two and two together, so that people are recognising there's been a trauma here, there's a reaction here, and the two are linked.
Yeah. Kate's, some of this work will be linked into the committee. We are going to have the responsibility of looking at that integration of health and social care, and this, I think, is very complimentary. Nanette,
The convener just made my point, basically, with the patchy nature of referral initially. Another point that was made to us was organisations like the police service, where there seems to be, where there is a lot of traumatic experience ongoing, but there doesn't seem to be a recognition within the organisation that this happens. And I just wonder if organisations such as that, I'm not just saying only the police, but is there a case for obviously raising awareness in these sort of setups?
We've had a contract at the River Centre. We've had a contract with Lothian and Borders Police for about 15 years to provide psychological support services. So I think the emergency services, and we have contracts with some of the fire and rescue services as well throughout Scotland. So I think there is a recognition that there is exposure to emergency service personnel. My feeling is you need to look beyond emergency services to see the gaps in service provision.
It wasn't even so much from emergency services, it was just the ongoing experience of someone who's dealing with traumatic issues throughout working life, which then become taken on and become personalised problems for the individual concerned. There doesn't seem to be the recognition of that sort of issue.
I think you're right. I think one of the difficulties is the media would have you believe that post-traumatic stress disorder is the only reaction to trauma, and that PTSD really only happens to veterans of the armed forces, and that people coming back from Iraq and Afghanistan who've been exposed to high levels of trauma will develop PTSD, and that's very, very misleading. PTSD is a very small proportion of the reactions to trauma. We reckon about 3 to 4% of the reactions to trauma take the form of PTSD. Much, much more common is depression. That's the most common reaction to trauma, is a depressive disorder. Second to that are other anxiety disorders, panic disorders, other anxiety-based difficulties. PTSD comes way, way down the bottom of reactions to trauma. And this is why it's not recognised, because its manifestations, the way it shows itself when people go to see their GP or when they see a health professional, it's not clear-cut, it's not obvious, and that's why people don't make these connections.
I think one of the problems is that the approach to dealing with this is that it's basically a circuit and see approach. This might work, and if it doesn't work well, you can try something else later. What needs to happen is that the experts in the field have to be listened to, and if there's somebody available that can provide the treatment that's necessary. The difficulty is that a lot of the approach is based on localism, right? That one health board may take one approach and another health board may take another approach. What we need is a uniform system whereby our people can fit straight into that. And once somebody is recognised in the position suffering post-traumatic stress disorder related to a miscarriage of justice, that there is action then can be taken for the very earliest stage to follow through on that, and we don't need to keep going round and round the houses trying to find somebody and being told that no, that's what you have to do. There's no other way of approaching it. You must go to the GP must refer you here, and that's the path that you've got to follow.
I mean, that's really what I would aspire to, that there's a clear trauma pathway, and it's not too different for survivors of childhood sexual abuse. It depends where they are. And aspiration, it would be great if there's a clear trauma pathway, GPs identify, they know exactly where people need to go. But that doesn't exist at the moment.
Is really, we can get support for our clients. Can I just say?
I know, but I need to let other panellists in as well. I've got all these committee members all desperate to get in as well.
From your point of view, this is important, because if we could control the resources that were available, we could much easier get the treatment to our people. We've got a situation whereby, as Kate said as well, they're having to raise money to provide the service, right? Yeah. We're having to put on fundraising gigs to pay for one of your clients' counselling because the counselling's been discontinued. That's insanity. It's absolute insanity. It's no approach at all. It's take what you can get where you can get it, and it's not acceptable.
Is there any other panellists wanting at this stage? Richard.
So I have some experience in that. I was involved. I was a GP locally in the time of the Dunblane incident, and spent 6 months thereafter actually providing support to that GP practice in Dunblane. What I found interesting was that, and that's really following the point that Dr. Fyvie's been making, is that quite a lot of people didn't actually want to engage initially at all. Indeed, from the studying that I did at the time, because I wasn't that knowledgeable about that particular area, trauma reaction, was that actually early engagement and application of psychological services to someone who's immediately gone through a trauma can be actually counterproductive, that people have their own defences. And I think the point that Dr. Douglas was saying is vital, that what we need is a trauma pathway, because what we need is, if someone goes through a trauma, let's say, take miscarriage of justice, 982 people were successful in the appeal court between 1999 and 2009. Now, if you take that group, how many of them were actually then given some sort of a personal contact, not necessarily to intervene at that point, but someone that they were told when they came out of that court, not just the champagne, but they actually were told at that point, here's your personal contact. Here is someone that you can turn to. You may find you get on absolutely fine after this. You can put it all behind you. But if you're finding any difficulty, and you may find some difficulties, phone this number or phone this person that has someone who keeps an eye on it. And it's the same with a lot of these traumas, that some people will handle it themselves, will get through it. Although it may re-emerge in later years. Some other thing may trigger it. I mean, the firearms issue in Durham this week, I think, will trigger some of my patients that were involved in the Dunblane incident, because seeing that the firearms thing is not being dealt with properly again, will trigger it. My point is that I wonder if the panellists can give us an idea of how they see that trauma pathway, because PTSD is only the tip of the iceberg at the end of the day. It's only the final reaction.
Trauma pathway, what would it look like? Kate?
Elaine, do you want, was it yourself, Elaine? No, you want to go first?
Pardon?
Sorry.
No,
Oh, we're
I
just-
asked
sorry.
you, please.
Thank
yeah.
you. Apologies, convener. Yeah, I think it's interesting, there's 992 victims of a miscarriage of justice in 10 years. I think just to give a perspective that every year there are over 300 children referred onto the Child Protection Register or for children's hearings because of sexual abuse, either directly or indirectly, that they're affected by, and over 1,000 children every year on the Child Protection Register or through the children's hearing because of emotional abuse. The figures are absolutely staggering, actually, and if you think about how many of those children are receiving support in a service, it probably doesn't come close when, the official statistics suggest that actually the number of counselling staff employed in the entirety of children and adolescent mental health services in Scotland increased from 1 person in 2011 to 10 in 1 year. That's 10 for the whole of the country in one area of specialism on that. So in terms of the trauma pathway for children and young people, just echo exactly what Elaine said. It has to become much more part of the GIRFEC pathway. I think we're all quite clear actually on the evidence now about the impact of a poor start in life for children in terms of child development and how that goes on to manifest itself in terms of long-term impact. And it's not just in the child's well-being in terms of their mental and emotional well-being, but also how well they do at school. They're more likely to end up neat in terms of not in employment, training or education once they reach young adulthood. They're more likely to become homeless, they're more likely to end up misusing substances. So, we know all that evidence. Harry Burns has done his job well in that we know what happens when children are traumatised in their earliest years. But I don't think we have, and we are all working on things like early years collaboratives and how to make sure that children get the support that they need to recover from those early experiences. And I think the bit that's still the disconnect is about if our specialist trauma is based in health, I think there's still a disconnect there between, in terms of the GIRFEC pathway and also being a trauma pathway and ensuring that children and young people receive specialist trauma services where they need it at the earliest possible opportunity because of this kind of artificial gap, if you like, between health and social care services. And sometimes, very often, the ability to kind of cross-refer and to wrap those services around the child is better and is good in lots of places, but we know it's inconsistent, as Paul said. And just to make a very quick point about victim-led services, in response to what Bob said, Children First, as most others around here, we work in that way, very child-centred and family-led. And many of you will have seen over Christmas a young woman called Jess who helped support our child sexual abuse campaign by coming forward and telling her story. And what is interesting actually is not even just what happened to her, but how she was given as much space as she needed and she led where the therapeutic work went. So some of it actually was about allowing her to do very childlike things, because to use art in a very childlike way, and sometimes it was just about allowing her to go out in the field next to the cottage where our Highland service is based and go out there and kind of use a hockey stick and a ball to kind of deal with her emotions and her anger until she was able to come back in. In another situation in our Murray service, we worked with a woman who'd been very seriously abused in very violent situation, and she couldn't talk about her experiences at all. So again, she used art and music actually to try and create, to get some of her feelings out there, so that she was in a position to start talking about. So, you know, I think obviously the experts and the specialists and like the River Centre and health professionals they have huge skills and experience, expertise to bring to situation, but sometimes it has to be a kind of partnership approach, I think, if it's going to work, in terms of how finding the way, if you like, that you can have somebody who's been so traumatised they can't talk about their experiences actually start expressing how they're feeling and what's going on inside them.
Yes. Yes,
Oh, just very briefly, just to Kate, just to say that we do work closely with social work, and one of the things that we're very feel quite passionately about is prevention. So we know that children leaving care are particularly vulnerable to re-victimisation, and we've set up a project in Glasgow with children leaving care, identifying people who are particularly vulnerable, training the staff, and so we do work closely with social work. In terms of trauma pathway, just briefly, as Claire was saying, increasing identification at GP level, health service, health visitor, etc. And then building capacity among staff in social work and in health to do what they can. And then recognising people who require specialist treatment and having small specialist teams. So it's a kind of triaging type pathway, I think, that we're looking for here.
Comments
Yes.
about a user-led service, because I think it demonstrates how different they look to what we have in statutory services. At the River Centre several years ago, we noticed about a third of our patients were veterans of the armed forces, and we felt we weren't delivering a service very well to them, or as good as it could be. So we got a group of them together and we asked them, if you were designing a brand new service for veterans, what would it look like? And they designed a one-stop shop, somewhere where they didn't need an appointment, they could just go off the street, they didn't need a referral, and they could go with any problem whatsoever. Didn't have to be trauma, didn't have to even to be mental health, it could be a debt, it could be alcohol problems, it could be relationship issues, it could be housing, anything. And that's what they designed. And we went to the Scottish Government. We were very lucky. We got the ear of Jeff Huggins at the Mental Health Division, and he basically said, how much do you need to do this? And we put it together, and it's now a service called Veterans First Point, and it's just off Princes Street. It's been running now for a number of years, very successfully. It was designed by veterans, it's run by veterans, and it's for veterans and their families. And it gets around the stigma of having to go to your GP with a mental health problem, because you can turn up on the door with any problem at all, and you can be seen under one roof for any problem.
Jumping back and forward between adults and children and things, but
Yeah. Just go with the flow, I'm afraid that's what I can.
But just, I think the other thing that goes unrecognised in children is actually the way they present with trauma symptoms are different than the way an adult might present. You get some of the same kind of things, but you also get a lot of just very disturbed behaviour, which can be put down to, schools find it very difficult to contain these kids. They're always in trouble. It gets it gets compacted all the time because it's not really recognised, because they are difficult kids to parent, they are difficult kids to teach. And I think it gets, the understanding that this is not just a bad child or a child with ADHD or a child with, there might be all those other things going on. But some of these kids, particularly the ones that have had that sort of abusive neglect early start, where in the first few years of life, pre-verbal years, it affects the brain growth, it affects everything, and will have an impact. And I think some of the work that is done, I think when we're talking about early intervention, is also that psychoeducational stuff with parents and carers and professionals working with people who've been through trauma, and if the child's old enough, with the child themselves, obviously, but understanding the kind of impact it has. I mean, sometimes parents are really, some parents don't have the capacity, but a lot do have the capacity to actually be interested in information about how trauma affects the brain, for instance, or how this might impact on them. And remembering that a child's trauma might be triggering off stuff that they've had in their lives as a child or any stage in their life that's triggering off a trauma for them. So I think that whole psychoeducational stuff can happen quite early on, before ever, doing work, if you like. Because as somebody said, not all people want to come and talk about a trauma, but it's about them understanding how the impact may have on them, and what to do about that. And also this thing of, particularly with sexual abuse, isn't so many children just feel responsible. It's their fault.
Yeah.
The investigative process, everything that we know has to happen and in the long run is good, can be very traumatic in itself for children, because they've been threatened that if you tell, such and such will happen, and of course it does.
Yeah.
Everybody falls out and the family fall apart, and all the things that they've been threatened with by their clever, skilled abuser comes to pass. So I think we have to get better actually that early bit, even even before the kind of doing one-to-one work with children and their families.
Paul?
Yeah, I was interested to hear what Claire said there, because I wish somebody would approach us and say what they said in relation to the veterans, because it's certainly no our experience that that's how we reacted to it. It may be that miscarriages of justice doesn't raise enough an awareness in the public view to get that kind of concentration on what our client base's problem is. What we're having to do is rely on the goodwill of specialists, of lawyers, of doctors who want to offer time and services to us, and we're having to go out every day and find that for ourselves. There's nobody bringing that together for us. There's no packages in there that we can tap into. We don't have support for the health boards. We don't have support for the social work department. We're not even on the radar, and we do make attempts to try and include ourselves as much as we can, but again, we're very limited resources. We have to do 101 things, and we don't either have the manpower, we have 2 paid staff, we have 10 volunteers, we don't have the time or the resources to go out and even do 10% of the work that we would want to do, and that's the difficulty that we face. We would love to, we are a bespoke service for our clients. They can come to us. We are a safe space for our clients. Ian spoke earlier about Ian's situation. Ian can walk into our office and be himself. He can't do that in any other space anywhere in the world, but he can do it with us, and we're having to do it begging and borrowing and pulling things together just to ensure that we can keep the door open. And that's our difficulty. We need some appreciation. We've kind of slipped through the cracks. There doesn't want that. I mean, society doesn't want to recognise what's happened to miscarriage of justice victims, because there's too many questions have to be asked after that. What is wrong with the system? Where are we going wrong? How do miscarriages of justice occur? If all the questions have got to be answered, then it opens up a Pandora's box, and I think people are reluctant to open that door. And that we have to deal with that, sort of the perception of no smoke without fire for our clients. Just go on with your life, all these sorts of nonsense things.
Suggestion. It's just on the back of a contract that we have with the Scottish court system, Scottish Court Service, and judges at their discretion can decide if a jury has been exposed to particularly traumatic material, they can give those jurors access to services at the River Centre. And I'm just thinking the way that works is they're given a leaflet that explains these are the kinds of psychological reactions you may or may not experience. If these become problematic, then these are the services that you can access. And I'm just thinking in the same way it might be possible to give people who've suffered a miscarriage of justice that information, some kind of material that says these are the problems you may experience, and if so, this is how to get help. Just routinely to give them that.
We do it's part of the application process for the Criminal Case Review Commission. Our information is given to anybody that applies through that, but not everybody that passes through the court system ends up at our door or necessarily acts on that. We would hope to be able to get to everybody, but unfortunately we don't. We don't have the capacity to do that at the moment.
Yeah, just a couple of things that I think have come up during the discussion. One is around the discussions focused on the fact that there's a training need for whether it be for psychologists, whether it be for GPs, whether it be for social workers. And I suppose the concern that I would have, and I wonder what the panel's views are, is when we do get to the point at which an individual comes into contact with these services, are we confident that they are then being given the appropriate diagnosis? If there is a training need and an awareness need there, are we confident that the appropriate diagnosis is being given, particularly given the comment Dr. Fyvie made around how low down the order of trauma-related disorders PTSD actually is? And then beyond that as well, I wonder around the wider public perception out there. The public perception would tend, I think, toward military service personnel by and large, because people have seen, you know, the news coverage, the documentaries around things like, for example, Gulf War syndrome and issues like that, and maybe there's not as much of an understanding of how trauma affects other sectors of society. And I made the point during the discussion we're having this morning that often what we're talking about here is not post-traumatic stress disorder, it's continuous traumatic stress disorder, because for many people the traumatic situation is not concluded. The traumatic situation is often one that is ongoing, and are we maybe at risk sometimes of maybe not even so much the misdiagnosis element, but also the mislabeling, and assuming that we're dealing with trauma that isn't, while an incident may be in the past, the trauma that is related to that incident continues.
Responses? Okay.
Maybe just add as well that I think some basic training and recognition and awareness raising amongst education professionals for children and young people, I think, is vital as well. And I think that comes into play in terms of exactly Elaine's point that some of the behaviours that manifest themselves in children and young people make them hard to teach. And, you know, quite often children and young people and families will be referred into our wider family support services because a child's been excluded from school, or is referred into our befriending services because the child's not socialising well or is having difficulties at school. And sometimes that can be the point of referral, but actually that kind of behaviour is telling us something about something else very often that's going on or has gone on with the child elsewhere in their life. So I think there's just something about education professionals also needing some level of training and awareness raising about, and also just there is something as well about the capacity, and again echoing what Elaine said, that not all the work that you do is about kind of treating a young traumatised person. Sometimes it can be the work that we do will be about supporting the whole family, because actually, you know, with that level of intervention, the parents have the skills and resilience and knowledge to go away and support the child themselves. And again, if you look at additional support needs framework and how it's supposed to work, it is about more children being supported better through universal services, through universal education. So from that perspective, it's about building the capacity of all professionals working with children and young people. But I would definitely add education into social workers.
Yeah, I would agree. I mean, just recently we've been a young person who's been seeing a school counsellor, actually guidance teacher, and has formed a really good relationship with that guidance teacher. Doesn't want to come anywhere near any of the other services, but that guidance teacher is kind of feeling a bit out of his depth. But it's very keen to do it, and actually we're supporting him to support this young person, which is good, but it would be really good to have some maybe more specialist training given, because I think, you know, the guidance counsellors and the guidance teachers, or whatever you want to call them, some have actual counsellors in school, that is where the child is. They can often be seen, they don't feel it's a stigmatising, you know, all that kind of stuff, which is where we lose a lot of our kind of young adolescents, I guess, is, I'm not coming along to talk to you, you know, that kind of thing. And you do get that very churlish kind of adolescent behaviour thrown in, you know, to them wanting to come along to a service at all. And yet their behaviour is such that I was at a case conference just the other day, a child protection case conference, where the school is saying we have to exclude this 6-year-old because the level of disruption within the school is so great. Now, she's a very traumatised little girl and sexually abused. But she's being sexual herself in school. She's barking like a dog. She's hiding under tables. She's doing all kinds of things that scare the life out of the other kids as well. She's, you know, there's lots of neglect issues and parenting issues and lots of things. So it's not just this child. But, you know, the head teacher saying, you have to do something about this kid because I have to protect all the kids in this class. And this little girl's going to get excluded because there's nothing we can do fast enough to you know, to sort that out.
I think Mark asked the important question. We've been around it, and I think Kate alluded to it earlier. But you know, it's not necessarily a shortage of resources. You know, when we look recently, and we have been still just finished teenage pregnancy last week, we touched on some of these issues again, and there's a myriad of people. There's all sorts of people. You're on a school. Where is the counsellors in the school? Where is the school nurse in the school? Where is the health? And how these, you know, what if we can describe a pathway, which we seem to have got to deal with some of the gaps and some of the unmet need that we're all agreed on. We've got a pathway. What workforce is it that's going to deliver at that? Is it going to be a workforce that's based on early intervention and prevention, or is it the people, we're just going to keep putting more and more people into dealing with the crisis that we have now, the 300 children sexual abuse, the 1,000 that are emotionally you know, affected and reported to Children's Park. What a legacy that's building up, and the predictions that these kids, as a consequence of that trauma in their lives, are going to go on and inflict trauma on others, and you know, just perpetuate this. You know, it's scary, isn't it? But what Mark was asking, what would this workforce look like? And we had education again introduced, and you know, it's simply not up to the health service.
I think it's across all agencies, really. But everyone can play a part. I mean, you know, parenting programmes can play a part. Early intervention programmes can play a part. But I think it needs, at the moment...
working together. I think Kate's challenge was, are they effectively working together? Lane?
I think that there's a lot of will to work together. I think people are very protective of, you know, they've got their own remits, they've got their own waiting lists, they've got all kinds of things they need to do. I think even with GIRF, the whole GIRFIC thing, you know, it causes upset about who's going to be the lead professional, who's going to be, you know, this, you know, I think it's, you know, the definition of people's jobs and their remits adds in another layer to them. And to expect them to do that without either additional resources to do it or the right training to do it, because, I mean, I think it working together is the only way forward. I think a whole systemic approach is the only way forward, rather than, you know, obviously within that individual work with people, but a systemic approach. But I think it's quite hard. You would get a lot of resistance to people taking on another bit to their job without the proper backing. They think that, you know, often they say, we've got enough to be doing, that's not my remit, that's not my job.
Mark, you want to follow some of this through before I get Gillen?
And I think Elaine McBride there highlights some of the difficulties and challenges that are faced in many respects, in the sense that for all that we're approaching an integration agenda, that all that we're trying to get services and agencies working together, there is still that silo mentality out there that it's not my remit, therefore somebody else should be picking this up. And I guess there's a challenge to us all there as to how do we break down some of those barriers and ensure that, you know, okay, it may not be essentially that individual's remit, but they should have a role in making sure that the situation is dealt with and not simply wait for another agency or organisation to pick it up. But I think that the point you make, convener, is a good one. Is that, you know, there is a role there, and I think early intervention has to be the key. I think in terms of prevention, obviously we want to try and get to a situation where we don't have miscarriages of justice arising, where we identify children at risk before they become children being harmed, and these kind of things, and you know, where we get to the situation. But we're always going to have people suffering traumatic incidents in certain areas. That's just how life goes. We can reduce that hopefully by taking an appropriate approach. And I think the key is, how do we ensure that where somebody, whether it is a fireman arriving at the scene of a road traffic collision and having to cut a dead body out of a car, whether it's, you know, a child who suffers abuse, whether it's a person who finds themselves wrongly convicted of a crime and is then cleared later, whether it's an army service personnel who's injured overseas, how do we ensure that at the earliest possible point these people get the help that they require and the correct referrals they require? Because otherwise, the issues that Dr. Fivey is talking about, you know, you've got post-traumatic stress disorder down here, and then up there you've got things like depression, like self-harm, like suicidal tendencies that can often flow as a result of unmet need. How do we ensure that we have the appropriate interventions at the earliest possible stage? That's got to be the focus.
I think wanting back in
Well,
on that, Gil, I'm aware of you wanting in.
Just very, very briefly then, I thought Mark McDonald made an important point about how do we capture this. It's the preventative stuff, yes, but when trauma does happen, how we get at that trauma and work with the victims at the earliest opportunity and provide an appropriate service. And something Elaine McBride said earlier on about initial assessment in terms of waiting times, you mentioned that, and Dr. Douglas had mentioned triage. So it's about how do we prioritise assessing everyone as quickly as possible. So rather than waiting 18 weeks for that initial assessment, an initial assessment and the recognition that some people may have to wait quite a lot of time because relative to others who have significant trauma, theirs is a more, want to downplay, a more mild form. Are we good at the, based on Mark McDonald's point, are we good at early assessment and prioritisation?
Sorry.
Yeah, no,
I think we can be. I think, unfortunately, when you've got, well, again, speaking with the Lothian Child and Adolescent Mental Health Service, it's not just a trauma service, it's a mental health service, apart from the specialist team, which is just right now sexual trauma. So you've got the competing needs of people coming in to be assessed for all kinds of things that aren't particularly trauma related. There are all kinds of mental health needs. And again, as I said earlier, I think what can happen is that the criteria for being prioritised, I guess, which would be, you know, psychosis and, you know, perhaps, you know, depression, self-harm, things that can be the result of trauma, but are the result of lots of things. But even within them, there'll be priorities. So my fear, I guess, for trauma that can come in with a variety of symptoms might not hit the top of the ladder.
Kate?
Yeah, I just wanted to, in response to what Bob was saying about how do we make sure that people who've been traumatised get access as quickly as possible, and raise awareness of one particular group that we work with, and by its very nature, because we support children who've been sexually abused to recover, very often that involves supporting them through court proceedings, in fact, right from the beginning of investigation of a case all the way through to its conclusion, which, because of the nature of our justice system, can take years and dominate years of children's lives. And there's something about having to go through that process as well as prepare to relive what happened to you if you are given evidence in that is a trauma in itself. And one of the things we developed was a national therapeutic service to support children and young people going through court proceedings, but more especially to train our support workers and therapeutic workers, practitioners themselves in kind of skills to work their way through the court proceedings. But one of the biggest issues in that is that the prosecuting authorities, Procurator Fiscal, in some areas still are very resistant to therapeutic work to help a child recover, beginning at all before the case is concluded, for obvious reasons. So it's a fine balancing act. But if you think about it, that in some cases it can be 2 years from start to finish, that's 2 years of a child who's been sexually abused, not only having had that happen to them, but have to relive the trauma of that without getting any therapeutic support. So one of the things that we have long campaigned for, and we will be campaigning as part of the Victims and Witnesses Bill, is for a child witness support service to be set up across Scotland, which is specialist, that provides children with the information they need and the support, but really specifically supports them to give their best evidence, but begins in a sensitive way the therapeutic support they need to recover from their trauma while not jeopardising proceedings. And they are a specific group of children, young people, and sadly they're an increasing group, and there's just not enough specialist support there to help them get through court proceedings, although things have improved generally through victim information services, but they need a specialist support service.
I think I think that's right. I do think that the child witness guidance, and this might not be, it might be different in different areas as far as whether the PFs take that on board, I don't know, does say that if the child requires therapy or counselling of some kind, that should be paramount. What we tend to do is inform the PF that we're seeing a child if there's a court case pending, because we know it can go on for long enough, and it'll come up to the day and it'll be put off, or there'll be delays, or there'll be whatever. So we know that goes on, but sometimes it's not the right time to be seeing a child. So we support the system, we support the family that way. But other times, if the child requires to be seen because they're symptomatic or there's so many worrying symptoms coming forward, then we would always inform the PF that's what we're doing, so we can't be accused later by a defence lawyer or whoever that we've been contaminating evidence, and we'll say the kind of nature of stuff, even if it's just a containing exercise with this child while they're awaiting the court.
There's no one else. We've got another 10 minutes or something. Gil Patterson would like to come in.
Thanks. My question's on access too. I don't want to personalise this too much, but it's in relation to the 3 people that we spoke to this morning. Each of them had been referred to the River Centre, and one had gained access within 2 weeks of bringing her case to someone's attention. The other one was 3 months, and the other one was 8 months. But the 8 months one was in relation to seeing a specialist, because this person declined participating because it was group that was being offered, I believe. And my question is relating to, what does this mean when group sessions take place? Is that part of the assessment? Is it part of treatment, or is it a holding operation? I was not, I wasn't clear from what was being explained to me this morning exactly what it meant. I did ask some questions, but I couldn't come to any conclusion on it from the answers I got.
So I'll very quickly tell you the path that people take when they arrive with us at the River Centre. We do an assessment within 6 to 8 weeks of every referral. And what we're looking for is, are they in the right place? Have they come to the right service? There's no point them sitting on a waiting list to see us and then it turns out they're better served somewhere else. So are we the right service? What's the degree of risk? How high is their suicidality, for example, or their self-harming behaviour? So that's what we're looking for. And if they are in the right place, we make a decision with the client. Are you suitable to go into a group? Now, by group, I think what people were talking about is our psycho-ed group. And that's a small group of people, about 6 to 8 people, who facilitated by 2 clinicians, and it's about understanding traumatic stress reactions so that people have a better understanding of what's happened to them, what's going on, what kind of problems they're having, and we're starting to get information across about managing those problems. So it's primarily a psychoeducation group that people start off in with us. After that group, it's a 7-week group. At the end of that, we do a review. So the patient will meet with 2 clinicians and they'll see where the patient's up to. If they need individual treatment after that, then they're put on a further waiting list to wait for individual treatment. Most people do require individual treatment, and that's when you get your one-to-one evidence-based treatments at that point. But it's a process, and not everybody needs the same input. So we're trying to tease out what works best for whom.
So in effect, it's perhaps maybe someone comes on to that group session and that might be the end of their journey because things develop within that and, you know, it can be taken care of out with the centre. Is that? But that seems to be the low number, are you saying?
It is a low number. Sometimes people will say to us at the end of the groups, they'll say, well, I know now I'm not going crazy. I'm not going to end up in the Royal Ed. I understand what's happening to me. I can make sense of it now. And I know what I need to do. So thank you. That's all I need. And some people, we part company with them at that point. It's a minority, though.
But is it, so therefore, is it part of the treatment then, would you say, or is it a parking exercise to enable a person who's got to wait? It looks as if, you know, from what we were told, the whole process till they see a specialist is about 8 to 9 months.
Well, the group, the psychoeducation groups are run by specialists. They're run by senior clinicians. And part of the group process is the clinicians are getting to know the patients as well. It's a two-way thing. And I would hope that our staff would pick up if there were any reason to take a person out of the group, to prioritise them, to you know, take them out of that group process, and they would do that. So they are seen by specialists from day one.
Another question that Nanette Millen raised, this is a general question. Sorry, my apologies.
Just to add to what Claire said, I mean, it is part of the treatment. The treatment of choice, particularly for complex trauma, is what's called phase-based treatment. And phase 1 is about establishing safety. And it is about psychoeducation and learning how to cope with your anxiety. So that's clearly part of the treatment, that phase 1. So I just want to clarify.
Just a quick one on one of the explanations, what had happened to an individual, and my own experience with some friends and further apart who are involved in the police service. There seems to be a high incidence of care required for individuals, individual officers. And I wondered, just like the armed services, if we shouldn't be looking to those services for some expertise within it, so that, you know, thinking about preventative element of it, that before it gets to a really serious stage, that maybe we should be investing in there to see, you know, look at things flagging up and see the kind of signs of something happening. Having said that, I know a person that everything was hunky-dory and then the next day everything in the whole world collapsed. So, I mean, I know it's complex, but I wonder if we should be looking to the services themselves more meaningfully. Or can it only be done by referring to people who are, in effect, experts?
I mean, should we be learning from the occupational health services of the emergency services?
Yes, I think so.
Is that your question? I think the answer is yes, and we certainly try to do that within Lothian and Borders. We've worked, as I said, for about 15 years with Lothian and Borders Police, and we provide them with a fast-track system, fast-track service. So if their occupational health services do pick up early problems, they will refer them to the River Centre and we will see them within 10 days. And that's a contract that is paid for by the police.
All right, okay. Thanks. I missed that then. Thanks very much.
Elaine, and then I've got Paul.
Finally, I do think that the only way to provide a full trauma service for, well, whether it be adults or, but in my case, with children and adolescents, is to have more people, though. We can't, it's not just about we've got enough resources and if we had a better pathway, because I know my colleagues in child and adolescent mental health are literally, well, not literally, are on their knees with dealing with the amount of other kinds of cases that come into child and adolescent mental health. And with us trying to expand into a full trauma team and not specifically just sexual trauma, there is no way. We have 4.3 whole-time equivalents across Edinburgh, Mid and East Lothian to provide a sexual trauma service. So for Lothian, it's not a lot of people to considering the longevity of some of the cases that we have to work with. And the only way we could offer a trauma service, which there's a lot of willingness to do and a lot of evidence that it would work, is actually to give the funding for more staff to actually do that trauma service and do all the stuff we're talking about in a really organised way with pathways and psychoeducational stuff and groups take up a huge amount of time with children because they have to be so well, you know, contained, I suppose, because kids can go all over the place. So all that kind of stuff that we know works, but it's just so staff intensive, and we just don't have the staff to do it.
Right, again, this interesting point, but what should that workforce look? Should it be educationalists? Should it be, you know, artists? And,
Yeah, combination.
What skills do they bring there? And we know that currently GPs are not trained to that level. Should we be looking to GPs, or, you know, why isn't there a mental health nurse or a trauma, you know, deal with some of this in every practice as specialist nurses, as we have for maybe diabetes or other, you know, you know, when you look at the scale of the problem, then, you know, it is a question of how seriously we take it, Paul.
Well, I mean, that's the thing for us. Our problem is our access to resources and being supported to get the access to the resources that are apparently out there that we certainly only seen any signs of. Nobody's coming to us with that. Nobody's opening doors for us. So we need that. You're asking for specifics about what kind of workers. I mean, we could do the services ourselves if the resources were put into our organisation and we could beef up what we were wanting to do. We know what we want to do, we know where we want to go, we know what support we need to offer to our people. We just don't have the opportunity, we don't have the actual, I mean, if we could employ people, we would rather take it in-house, employ specialists in each area. It would be, whether it was medical treatment, whether it's support with legal cases, educational stuff, all these things. We would rather have a bespoke service within our organisation to be offering all the things that our client base needs, because our basis is, our organisation's been created by people who have suffered trauma, and they're putting on the table what their requirements are. We're just needing to find ways to be able to access that.
Access it. Is there any other questions? I see you twitching there, Richard. Have you got a quick one? Yeah.
I just wonder, I mean, the CALM service are particularly under massive pressure, but you know, so are the adult psychiatry service. I mean, all the services that we've heard today are under pressure. Is there stuff downstream that we should be doing? I mean, for example, gardening leave was set up to try and help people who were not necessarily needing Hollybush in the veterans organisations. Other groups like ArtLink and other drama and all these wraparound services, which tend to be offered by small charities very often. But I mean, are these things which are helpful and people who are not at the stage of being diagnosed as PTSD, is that helpful at an earlier stage to give people the space to be able to manage things? Or do we need to beef them up in terms of training so that they have an understanding of, you know, what's appropriate and how to get people to understand what they're going through?
Any takers?
I would say definitely yes. And when we were asked to comment on the mental health strategy for Scotland, that's one of the main comments we put in. People generally don't come to professionals like myself. I mean, a psychologist is probably the last person you want to see if you've been traumatised. People go to their families and their communities first. And our comment on the mental health strategy was it didn't take enough account of that, and that really, in terms of beefing up resources, that's where you need to put the money into community-based, probably voluntary sector resources.
Kate?
Just to add that we're piloting some projects this year which were kind of a bit like back to the future for Children First in terms of going back to our roots, called Communities Putting Children First, and it's about training up volunteers to go out and engage with communities and individuals and groups around building their own resilience and capacity to think about what they can be doing as communities and individuals to protect children more. So rather than everybody sitting back and waiting for the professionals or the statutory agencies to come in, people actually taking responsibility, thinking about their attitudes, changing their behaviours. And it's kind of similar in that there's something there about just a kind of whole population approach, similar to the work of the Glasgow Centre for Population Health and Harry Burns around the assets-based approach to health and about investing in families and individuals' own resilience and capacity. And some of that work we do with families, because when children are referred into as, you know, where you have non-abusive parents, you will support them. But even in some of our family support work and some of the parenting support that we provide, we acknowledge that children are going back out of that programme eventually after however many weeks they've been there to live with parents who have issues, and that one of the things we have to do is build resilience in those children to cope with what life is going to continue to throw at them. So it's practical skills like health eating and understanding the importance of getting themselves to bed if somebody's not there to do that as they get older, but also just the soft skills about coping, about their own anger, about where to get help, about their own well-being. And I think there's just something about more of that work happening through universal services in their whole population, so that people are more resilient, depending, no matter what life throws at them, which actually then frees up specialist services like the River Centre to actually cope with the really severe impacts of trauma on some individuals.
Else? At this point, we draw it to a close, and a big thank you to all of those who've taken part in this session. A special thank you to those who took part in earlier sessions. Thank you very much for your attendance. I know that the session that we had was very good, challenging, and I think from the committee's point of view, there's so many fits that I see here in terms of young people and child pregnancies, evidence that we're looking at, the integration of health and social care, and of course the victims and witnesses proposed legislation that we're going to see. So it's been, although it's been a one-off session, I think it's been, it's been very important to us as a committee, and I thank you all on their behalf, and bring the public session of the committee to a close. Thank you all once again.